Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of Beyond Horizons. We just watched a cinematic following the Hyperion up to its designed job to do some orbital maintenance on the Hades interplanetary ship. The cinematic itself was inspired by someone called Yukon09, who I think has just set the bar incredibly high for Kerbal Space Program cinematics, so if you haven't seen any of this stuff, I would go check it out. But anyway, on with the mission at hand. So I ran into a couple of problems. I don't know if you saw, I have the rotation UI up for some reason. I don't know how I brought it up and I couldn't get rid of it. But the main problem was that I realized you have to be quite close to the cargo bays in order to access all the struts and the fuel lines that I wanted to affix to the ship. And unfortunately, we don't have any docking ports close to where we need those. So I had to come up with a bit of a dangerous solution. So I undocked the Hyperion and brought it down to where I needed it and had it just float precariously next to the Hades. And our engineer Maga had to just be careful not to get crushed between the plane and the ship. To take it one step further as well, because the range on the cargo bay isn't actually enough to go from one side of the Hades to the other, so we had to rotate the entire Hades to bring, each section underneath the Hyperion so that I could actually reach for the fuel lines. Due to the hazardous nature of the mission now, and the fact that we didn't do any proper risk assessments, man, I decided to forego the struts and we just focus on the fuel lines just to speed this process along. Okay, so I did attach a couple of struts, but then I realized it was going to be too hard to do all of them, so I just didn't do the others. The reason we wanted to add fuel lines to this thing is because I'm going to asparagus stage this main drive so we can eke out all the delta V that we possibly can out of this thing, because going to even back does require quite a bit of delta V, especially if you're lugging around, habitation modules and life support and everything that you need to keep Kerbals alive. And I've just realised I have completely messed up the asparagus staging here. So actually what I was supposed to do is have two of the tanks feed into the central one and then have the other two feed into the first two, so that we could ditch two at a time, but I have just made them all feed into the central tank, which is wrong, so that'll need fixing. There's no point sending up another one of these missions just to do that, so when we get crew in this thing, that's when we'll have all that fixed. Anyway, there are two of the fuel lines affixed, so now it's time to rotate the entire Hades so that we can do it again. And here I was just really hoping Magar wasn't in the way and wasn't about to get battered into, some higher orbit. Luckily, Magar was unscathed by this rotation, but unfortunately, the Hyperion was not. Yeah, you can see I just knocked it a little there, so hopefully we haven't dislodged any of the heat shielding on the underside, because that would be quite the catastrophe on the way back down. Luckily, the game doesn't actually simulate anything like that, but of course this was a real problem for the Columbia disaster, where a bit of the thermal protection on the underside had been damaged during launch, and of course then on the way back down, this allowed the heat and pressure to just destroy the wing and kill all the crew inside, which was pretty tragic, and we definitely don't want that happening here. Anyway, Magar Kerbin has finished her job of fixing the fuel lines to the Hades, so now it's time to head back home. So we leave the Hades to sit in orbit and wait for its transfer window to Eve. We do actually need to refuel it. I forgot that some of the fuel tanks actually had to borrow some of the fuel so that they could actually get into orbit. So we will have to send a refueling mission, but we'll do that later on. For now, our renowned pilot Valentina Kerbin has to bring the Hyperion back to the runway, and we're doing it on the nighttime side because of just how things worked out. I couldn't really be bothered to wait for it to become daytime at the Space Center. I just figured might as well land at night. So I've fixed the main issue of the Hyperion, namely its battery capacity. I did add a few more batteries, but that didn't really help, so I've just whacked a couple of RTGs in the cargo section there and just hope that it doesn't give my astronauts radiation poisoning. Although that very much depends on what fuel source these RTGs use. It's not really disclosed in the game, but if it's plutonium, which I think is the most commonly used one, then actually the radiation coming off it shouldn't be all that terrible. I think it's quite a low emitter of gamma and neutron radiation, so, you know, a little bit of shielding and the astronauts should be fine. Anyway, we're pretty much on course for the Space Center. I was going to overshoot, and so you might have seen me pull those hard S-turn maneuvers just so I could bleed off lots of speed in the upper atmosphere and come down near the Space Center. I'm making quick use of the trajectories mod just so that I can see whereabouts I'm actually coming down. I've realized I was going a bit too far, so I, flipped the plane upside down and pulled towards the ground just so I could, get a bit closer to the runway. And it all works fine, so I just begin my U-turn maneuver. Luckily, we've still got a little bit of fuel left. I was a bit worried that maybe if I didn't have enough and I had to do a big turn like this, then I would run out of energy and start falling out of the sky instead. But yeah, luckily we've got enough fuel just to tide us over to the runway. And you might have just had a quick glimpse there. I left the docking port open for the whole of that re-entry. So luckily the game doesn't properly simulate the heating from re-entry, otherwise the whole plane would have burnt up. But anyway, here we are coming back down at the Space Center, and the Hyperion is boasting its gliding capabilities beautifully here, which allows me to just gently put it down on the tarmac and return the astronauts home safely. So our orbital maintenance mission was pretty much a success, apart from a few missing struts. We'll have to refuel the Hades, and then it'll be ready for its journey over to Eve, carrying some brave astronauts who will spend several months on the surface of the hellish purple planet. On the topic of interplanetary voyages, we return to Echo 1, which is heading down to Moho. And we've got a mid-course correction, which will actually bring us on an encounter with Moho. But unfortunately, the encounter is going to be very quick, and we're probably not going to be able to achieve orbit on first pass. So we're probably going to have to do a few gravitational assists, and I'm going to see if we can try and use Eve to actually lower our orbit round the sun and hence reduce the speed at which we encounter Moho. And hopefully then we can actually get into orbit. We do have loads of fuel on this thing, but it's still not enough to brute force an encounter, just because the difference of speeds in Moho's orbit and Kerbin's orbit is so great that, yeah, you just need probably about 10,000 kilometers of delta V just to, achieve orbit on first pass. So yeah, we won't be doing that, but at least we will get a flyby and get some tasty science on the way, and then hopefully we can reduce our speed and eventually get into orbit. Our next course correction with this thing is in about 130 days, so we will be checking back in with this in a future episode. What with all the plans for infrastructure network around the Kerbin system, I wanted to design a sort of reliable shuttle to get astronauts to and from orbit. And I could have just done a simple capsule because they're very easy and reliable to make, but I wanted to do a sort of like spaceplane shuttle so that we could glide back to the runway and make sure we land, as close to the space center as possible to maximize the profit returns. So say hello to STS Nightshade, which I like to think of as the spiritual successor to the Hawk shuttle. Mainly because, like its predecessor, it has two air-breathing engines so that when it returns to an atmosphere, it can fly itself back to the space center, even if I overshoot the runway, which is always very likely. It will not be able to fly itself into orbit. I did think about making this an SSTO, but I don't really like the idea of an SSTO being able to go pretty much anywhere in the Kerbin system. So instead, this will be launched on the back of a big rocket, and once it's in orbit, it should have enough delta V to make it to either of Kerbin's moons and back again. And we're going to be putting it through its paces in this episode and give it quite a difficult maiden voyage because we need to rotate the crew of the Foxglove outpost on Minmus's surface. And by my calculations, this shuttle should just have enough Delta V to do just that. So, Nightshade is on her way to Minmus with the new crew for the Foxglove, who will be relieving the crew who are already out there. I think they've been up there for about 300 days now. I'll have to double check, but they have been there a lot longer than I had initially intended to leave them there. The launcher for the Nightshade, I haven't actually got a name for it yet, but it's a bit experimental. I have been using it as sort of a test vehicle for all the changes I want to make to the Hermes launcher. So we'll check back in with its return after the mission, but I put some vernier thrusters on it so that I could test how well they control inside an atmosphere. Because, of course, the ultimate goal of the Hermes launcher is to have it return fully powered on maybe some big landing legs back at the Space Center. Anyway, here we are coming into Foxglove Station. I haven't given the Nightshade any VTOL capability, so we're just landing on the back engine there, and then just before we hit the ground, we rotate it to put it on its landing gear, just because the low gravity of Minmus makes it very easy to do that. Now, we actually do already have a crew transfer vehicle here, namely Ayla 6, I believe, which I think I'll leave here as sort of an emergency return vehicle, just in case there's anything, you know, drastic happening here on the station, then at least the astronauts can come back in an instant and won't have to wait to be rescued. Because, you know, sometimes I get contract packs for the stations that I've got, which say, you know, someone's having a medical emergency, or we need to evacuate all the crew. And so I want to be able to do that, you know, at a moment's notice. Anyway, we're now rotating the crew, and I thought I would get them all stood in the plains of Minmus under the sunset here, just for a bit of a cool shot. You know, I like to think that they were having a bit of maybe a kickabout with the new crew, catching up, giving them some friendly advice about what to do and what not to do here on the distant outpost of Foxglove. While I was transferring the crew, something very strange happened. I switched to pods just as I was switching through the vessels, and it just tipped over and exploded for absolutely no reason. And unfortunately, I didn't have any recent quick save, so I could, you know, jump back and undo whatever weird crackeny nonsense that was, but it doesn't really matter. I think pod was out of fuel anyway. We couldn't refuel it because it can't even get into orbit, so it's not too big of a loss, but it is a bit of a shame. Anyway, here we are getting the new crew out on the surface as well. I thought this would be a really cool shot, having them all stood in front of each other, but it ended up looking more like a standoff. Once all the crew were done glaring at each other and the sun had just set, it's time to move the crew to their new respective bases and vehicles and what have you. So I've just skipped through all of that just because it took a really long time. And now we're going to sort out everyone inside the base, putting the scientists in the science module and making sure that all the experiments are running correctly. And yeah, well, I've set another timer for a crew transfer. We'll see if I actually pay attention to it or not. And with that, the new crew spin the plane eastward so that they can get a nice takeoff. And yeah, the low gravity is so weak that even the SAS modules can just tip the plane up and we can go straight into the air. Well, I guess you can't really say into the air because there's no atmosphere here, but anyway. Now, you might have seen when I was on the surface that I only had about 660 meters per second of delta V left, which isn't very much at all, but is just enough to get back down to Kerbin. But we won't be able to circularize with the engine, so we're going to do quite a number of aero brakes to bring our orbit down. And then from there, we can adjust it using the very small amount of delta V we have left to make sure we actually come back to the Space Center. All in all, I think this took about 4 passes through the atmosphere to bring our orbit nice and low. And then on the 5th attempt, our apoaps got a little too low, so we had to fire the engines just a little bit to keep the apoaps above the atmosphere. And from there, we circularized the orbit so that we could wait for the Space Center to pass underneath it, because as you can see, we're quite inclined here, so we just waited for the Space Center to come under our orbit and then deorbited from there so that we could come down onto the runway. And even though we're not back just yet, I am willing to say that the maiden flight of the Nightshade has been a success. It's proven itself to get pretty much anywhere in the Kerbin system and back again, and that's going to be quite useful when we have more infrastructure set up around. I think generally it's only going to be going to low orbit and potentially to the moon, but it's nice to know that it can reach all the way to the Minmus surface if necessary. And actually, it might even be able to get to the lunar surface because our journey out to Minmus this time was very inefficient and we had to do a big plane change maneuver on the way. So if things are a bit more perfectly aligned up, we should have more delta V to work with. So yeah, it could even probably reach the lunar surface. Not that I think it'll ever have to, because we obviously have the Moonfly, which is our dedicated lunar transport. So yeah, we'll see how useful the Nightshade ends up being, but I think it has definitely proven itself. Anyway, here we are coming back at the Space Center, where the old crew of the Foxglove are looking forward to some much needed R&R. Maybe they'll go on a holiday somewhere nice and warm, or perhaps just stay at home, kick their feet up and watch some telly. But no doubt they'll be back in their spacesuits soon enough for some more space exploration in the future. I know Megan and Seapond are definitely itching to get back in the pilot's seat and land on some more moons, so they'll be doing that hopefully in the future. In the meantime, we're checking back in with the launcher. As I said earlier, this is sort of our test bed for some changes we want to make to the Hermes launcher. Mainly the vernier thrusters, just to see if they're actually any good at maintaining attitude control on descent. And they are and they aren't. Like, they do help, and having the air brakes provide some attitude control as well does help us keep the thing oriented, but we have the same sort of problem where any deviation from the retrograde marker kind of gets amplified if we try and correct for it. So this works fine landing in the water, as you'll see here, but when landing on land, this could lead to tipping over and explosions, which we don't really want to have happen. So yeah, plenty to still be figuring out with these launch vehicles, but all of that will have to happen in a future episode, because that's all I've got time for today. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider leaving a like and maybe even subscribing to the channel. And if you want to catch up with older episodes, you can check out the playlist that this one is in. But I've been Moonfish1001, and I'll see you in the next video.